I'm Mark Schmitt. I'm a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, and this is a Blogging Heads in the Fireside Chats series of conversations sponsored by the Roosevelt Institute. And I'm here with Scott Lemieux, who is a political science professor, legal scholar, blogger at Lawyer, Guns, and Money, and blogger and writer for the American Prospect. Although, you know, when I was an editor of the American Prospect, you know, you were a great contributor to the blog. I don't think we had a ton of interaction during that period.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've actually been with the American Prospect since 2005. I wrote my first article about the Alito nomination, which I think holds up very well, arguing that he was going to be awful, and he was. Yeah, I mean, there's the Prospect sort of has a splendid isolation between the print and the online site. So I didn't know if I could describe you as my boss or not.
Yeah, there's that splendid isolation that, you know what there is. And I was very involved in the online site, but, you know, there's a kind of there's people who they just do their great stuff, and, you know, on it rolls. You weren't exactly a troublemaker. You didn't libel anybody. You know, it was a very good contribution, often crossing over from the work you did at Lawyers, Guns, and Money.
Exactly, and so, you know, I think we're obviously both pleased that the Prospect was able to come out of it stronger than ever with a terrific new issue. So, and you know, it's not as important for me, but particularly for the people there who are doing great work and who don't have day jobs to fall back on.
Absolutely.
It was tremendous for the Prospect to be saved. Right. So, I'm glad we were able to work there together as well.
Great. And your day job, why don't you say a little bit more about yourself? Your day job is at Capital.
Actually, at the College of St. Rose, a liberal arts college in Albany, New York.
Okay.
In the heart of Albany, New York, as they say.
Okay.
And you know, we're a relatively small school, but our women's soccer team was the NCAA Division II champion. So, so I'm not the highest profile member of St. Rose in the national community.
So, well, we'll get you there.
We're starting to get a little more right.
There's one thing Blogging Heads will do is move you up to a much higher level of national recognition.
Well, that's good. Yeah, so that'll make my
giving up on going to the mall.
Exactly.
All right.
So,
well, I want to talk about. I mean, you did some great work on the Supreme Court decision, which is now a week old, on the Affordable Care Act, and it seems like, you know, in that week, I think somebody wrote it. I don't think it was you. Somebody wrote something in the day, maybe last Friday or Saturday, pointing out that, you know, the news cycle everything had become so compressed that we had all the cycles of news had happened all in that first day, from the, oh my gosh, this is great, to, oh my gosh, it's a secret plot by Justice Roberts to undermine all progressive legislation in the future through the Commerce Clause, to, oh my God, it's actually just fine, and all those reactions happened. But in fact, you know, we've had a full week of, you know, various things playing out from that, and I think what I like to do is almost work backwards a little bit from where we are now with you know, you focus primarily on the legal dimension, and I've done a little bit in a sense the politics of it and the possibility of repeal. But I want to work back from where we are now with, you know, the news yesterday. I guess on July 4th, Mitt Romney came out and said, well, it's a tax after all. The fee that one pays if you don't meet the mandate requirements to purchase health insurance and you're above a certain income level. You know, the argument's been whether that's a penalty or a tax. That's kind of tied up nuts, and it's also been something that's fed into this meme on the right, the Wall Street Journal in particular, and Bill Kristol also, that, you know, Romney's a screw up. He's not on message. He's relying too much on an insular group. What do you think is the significance of the penalty versus tax politics here?
Yeah, my own perception, and, you know, my sort of instant reaction was that, you know, that's not a good thing for Obama exactly, that, you know, for Roberts to have decided this on the tax issue and for the Republicans to say, aha, we told you, they lied, it's a tax. On the other hand, you know, the individual mandate can't really be less popular than it is now. You know, it's pretty much anybody who would consider voting for Romney already dislikes the mandate. And as you say, the fact that Romney, and again, this goes back to the fact that Romney passed or signed almost virtually identical legislation when he was the governor of Massachusetts. That Romney's dithering about that, also probably didn't help things. So
well, it's a very strategic. I think with a lot of there are definitely things that just come out of Romney's mouth that are just kind of embarrassing and stupid, like corporations are people, or I like to fire people, things that just sound wrong out of context. And then there are a lot of things that sound screwy, but actually you realize people had a 3-hour meeting to figure this out. And he's crafted this very careful thing of saying, well, because in Massachusetts you didn't need to rely on the taxing power in the Constitution. Therefore, what we did in Massachusetts was not technically a tax, whereas what's done at the federal level, because according to Justice Roberts, it needs the taxing power, not the Commerce Clause, that therefore it has to be a tax. I mean, that's a very crafty, piece of BS, right?
Right. That's not really, and that's that's at a level where it's not really going to communicate. It's not a very effective message with voters. And again, the fact that it took him a week to arrive at that certainly doesn't help either.
Right.
And as you said, that almost any politician, no matter how good, is going to come up with things, as you said, that sound stupid out of context. But as Romney's gaffes are often seem to be the result of deliberate decisions,
right.
Which is unusual. It still sort of amazes me that he sort of won the Republican primary that nobody logically should have been able to win.
Right,
he was sort of the luckiest candidate in history, as John Jay always said. But he does have weaknesses as a candidate, and given the job reports that came out this morning, we better hope that it matters.
Right.
Unfortunately, as a political scientist, I always think this has, the candidate effects are fairly marginal, but this is looking like an election close enough where candidate skills could actually matter. That probably helps Obama, and this would seem to be an indication of that. But I do hope the economy picks up a little bit, because Romney could be the luckiest man in the world again, which would be
right.
Right. Bad for the country.
No, I mean, he doesn't seem to have that ability to, fall back on, okay, what is it I actually think? And then you could deviate from what you actually think. And of course, people do it all the time. But it's nice to have that little anchor.
Right, yeah, and it's never, and I'm the kind of person who is not sure that the real Romney isn't closer to what he is now than what he was in Massachusetts, but I think that just this trying to reconcile these two vastly different political cultures of what you need to do to govern a state like Massachusetts and what you need to do to be the head of the modern Republican Party, which we'll be getting into in a couple of seconds, which we're seeing with respect to the Medicaid expansion,
right.
and which you have written about with respect to whether or not they might completely repeal the Affordable Care Act. The sort of demands for being head of that coalition are fairly extreme.
Right.
The next time there's a Supreme Court nomination by a Republican, John Roberts will be defined as too liberal.
Right.
So
that's right. There's
a sort of ratchet effect when things keep getting pushed further and further to the right, and there's less deviation is acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what do you? I mean, the other dimension that keeps playing out is this story of what actually happened at the court, and I'm kind of astonished by. I don't read everything about the court. My sense is that there are things that I've read where years after the fact, we've learned really interesting things about the drama within the court on a complicated decision. I mean, certainly, the Casey decision on abortion in the early 1990s is a very big one where we've learned a lot about how Justice Kennedy's role evolved, Justice Souter's role, and so forth. I think there's some others where we've some that are actually black holes, right? I mean, we still know nothing about the background to Bush v. Gore, as far as I know.
Yeah, very little. A few clerks talked for that Vanity Fair article, and there were a few nuggets, but nothing like the detail we know.
Right.
And we know a lot about Casey because of Ed Lazarus's book. He was actually a Blackman clerk, so he. And that, that was fairly controversial.
Right, it's a very unusual move to. I mean, there aren't other clerks who've written books like that, or except maybe years after the. fact, right?
Right. So we actually know something about the New Deal court because there's a wonderful book where a guy was a clerk for James McReynolds, the famously racist and anti-Semitic judge, and so it was sort of a fascinating portrayal not only of what was going on at the court at that time, but about D.C. social circles. But these have been few and far between. The Brethren, of course, Bob Woodward's book, but that was mostly, that was a book that came out in the late 70s that mostly dealt with the very early years of the Burger Court. And that was years. And there's a lot of speculation, as I think Mark Tushnet recently wrote, that actually a couple of justices themselves talked to Woodward. It certainly seems as if Potter Stewart talked to him. But there's been the Lazarus book, and then the recent books by Jeffrey Tubman and Jan Crawford have a little bit of that, but you'll notice they seem to have a lot less direct stuff. Especially after the Lazarus book, there seemed to be a real crackdown. And what's interesting about this case is that seems to have gone away.
Right. I mean, I can't remember ever seeing anything that came out within the week after a decision.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, that's unprecedented.
And it's extraordinary because there are only, I thought there were 3 clerks per justice, but somebody told me there are 4. Plus there are clerks assigned to the retired justices. So you've got a total of 40-something people, or high 30s number of people. But, it's such a small group. It's such an elite group. The payoff, I mean, I could see, career mid-level people in the Defense Department. Of course, they talk to people. I mean, their identity is more important. There's value to that. If they're outraged by something, they'll talk about it. But the insular experience of being one of these, very small number of clerks for a very short period, and your whole career depending on, your justice, then, giving you a good launch into your legal career or your scholarly career. It just seems like the incentives to there are good incentives to not do it. Not many people do it. Not that many Hill staffers really talk to reporters very much, just because, there are more reasons not to than there are to. But here you've got a case where there seem to be at least 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 people talking to people outside the court, including Paul Campos.
Right, my colleague. Yeah, because there seemed to be at least 2 people talk to Crawford, and then an additional person talked to Campos. So we have at least 3 and possibly more.
Now you in the piece you wrote, you speculated that it was Kennedy himself who talked to Crawford.
Yeah,
which I haven't really seen
either
that
Kennedy
elsewhere.
or. Yeah, my theory is that either it was, and it almost had to be from the Kennedy chambers, unless Crawford was just trying to throw people off the scent. There was about a page or a page and a half of just, praise for Justice Kennedy that had no obvious relevance to the rest of the article. So it definitely, and the same thing, like in the Bob Woodward, you can tell exactly which chambers were talking to Woodward based on, based on who was looking good or bad. And they all made Warren Burger.
I mean, it's funny because the original theory, the speculative theory of what would happen with the case was, the only hope or the best hope for saving the law was Justice Kennedy's susceptibility to flattery, his desire to be in the mainstream, not be, that all the things that probably played a role in Casey, for example, and maybe in some other decisions, that all of those things might lead him to uphold the law.
Right. It's interesting that you were talking about what we know about Casey because of Lazarus and then the people who followed up on him, and that what happened in Casey was sort of similar to what Roberts did here, that eventually there's kind of a non-committal vote. Rehnquist was sort of trying to at least get a decision that would do damage to Roe, whether he said he was overruling it or not, but would have effectively overruled it. And then Kennedy just essentially switched, went over to O'Connor and Souter, and Souter was sort of the instigator of that and said, let's try to find a middle ground. And then they actually told Blackmun before they told the other conservatives and kept it secret. So I think that if you'd been told that somebody switched, you would have thought it was Kennedy. And certainly, I got this wrong. If you had told me before the decision came down that Kennedy would join a maximalist opinion, I would have assumed the entire act would be struck down.
Right.
I'm not surprised exactly that Roberts joined the majority, but I'm shocked that he was the swing vote. And that was, as Adam Liptak showed, completely unprecedented. This is the first time John Roberts has joined the Liberals in a 5-4 decision, which Scalia and Thomas have actually done multiple times. That there are a few, the Fourth and Sixth Amendment issues where often, Scalia and Thomas might join the Liberals and Breyer will flip over. Roberts and Alito never did that. They would occasionally join an already near unanimous decision, but would never be a swing vote. So, so I don't feel that bad about not predicting it, but it was, certainly if you told me that Kennedy was steadfast, I would have been amazed. And part of what seemed to be going on to me in the Crawford article was, whether it was Kennedy himself or Kennedy's clerks talking with Kennedy's tacit approval, that, I was not the one who was squishy here. That the audience that Kennedy seemed to be playing to were the conservatives who were often disappointed with him. And he was trying to send a message that, hey, I was standing up for what was right here, and it was Roberts who was squishy, but I did everything I could to bring him back into the fold. He tried to get me to flip, and I wouldn't. It almost seemed to be as much of a pro-Kennedy spin as it was an anti-Roberts spin, and that may explain the discrepancy that Paul found, where the people who were talking to Crawford tried to sell this idea that the dissent had been entirely written from scratch and was sort of this great statement of conservative first principles, whereas I think Paul has the stronger case that a lot of it would seem to have been written by Roberts as well. That the first 3/4 of it just reads like a majority opinion. It doesn't engage with the majority opinion at all, which suggests that was primarily drafted by the Roberts chambers or whoever else Roberts assigned to write parts of the opinion. So.
And then the question becomes, I love this phrase, which I don't think I'd ever really heard before, because I'm not really in this world. I love the phrase that, a certain you might want to take a certain position, but it won't write, which is to say that you really just have to throw everything out the window to actually write this decision and to write a decision this way. And that the possibility that at some point Roberts realized, you really can't just roll over severability the way that the dissent does, and that you really can't throw out the whole act in the way that they propose. That it just doesn't write.
Well, there was an amazing, which I hope we'll link to on the right, but there was kind of an amazing series of posts on balkanization, Jack Balkan's book, written by the Harvard law professor Mark Tushnet. And for a little background on that, Tushnet is sort of the most prominent of the critical legal studies scholars, the scholars who are sort of legal realists from a left-wing perspective, who sort of talk about the extent to which law is political. And the irony was, although some of what he wrote about precedent, very similar to what I've written, sort of echoes those traditional themes, his argument for Roberts was, it's actually simpler than it seems. As you say, he just thought the opinion wouldn't write. He started to write an opinion, and when he got to the taxing power, he was just unable to say something that made sense to him. And that doesn't exactly mean that politics didn't matter or that strategy didn't matter, in the sense that, one of the reasons he may have been especially conscious about getting a solid opinion was the public reaction he knew was coming. So I don't think you can separate out these factors. That obviously, I think that he was probably more attuned to flaws and arguments than he would have been otherwise. But I think that in a weird way, in a decision which we all assumed would sort of prove that that constitutional interpretation at the Supreme Court level is largely political, I think that in a sense the law mattered here, that Roberts was simply unable to make that. So it's sort of a counterintuitive argument coming from Tushnet, but he makes a surprisingly persuasive case. And I think something that I missed and a lot of people missed is that, it's not as if the institutional pressure on the court was any different when Roberts voted in conference as a month later. Roberts is not a dumb man. He knew he would get criticized by liberal editorialists. He knew that the kind of public pressure would come down in the court if there was a 5-4 decision striking down the whole act. So that cannot explain all of it. I think that explains part of it, but if that was all of it, then he just would have voted to uphold the legislation at conference. So. Surprisingly enough, Tushnet has convinced me that the law matters. So, anything can happen.
Well, I think that people, what's interesting about it is maybe in some level the law doesn't matter, but people like to think of themselves as, part of this professional elite that operates by these rules that are separate from politics. There is a kind of they don't necessarily believe that it doesn't matter always. I mean, Scalia sort of creates the greatest. On the one hand, his presentation of self or his own analysis is that he's entirely guided by the original meaning of the words and all that, and yet he's entirely reckless on the other side. And the others, I think, the distinction between their self-image and reality is a little bit closer together.
Right, and in the past, Scalia, and there even are cases in which Scalia, that on issues that are not a high priority for Scalia. So, as I said, certain, Sixth Amendment case and the Fourth Amendment case, or when it comes to, punitive damages against corporations and civil suits, there are even times in which Scalia will sort of put legal principles among political principles. In a much quieter way, I think the most consistent Republican Party liner on the court is actually Alito.
Right.
That he just doesn't seem to have any interest in any legal grand theory at all. He's pretty much free to sort of, vote Republican policy preferences in every case. Right. Scalia and Thomas are actually a little bit more complicated. Not on issues that they care most about. So if it's something like affirmative action that they care about, then the original meaning of the 14th Amendment goes out the window. But there are certain kind of lower tier issues where it'll matter. Scalia, though, has sort of, Scalia is definitely getting to that phase where he probably should have retired 3 years ago.
Right.
And I've actually speculated that Scalia's performance at oral argument probably didn't help Roberts stay on board.
Right. I actually think that going back to the oral argument, I actually thought both Scalia and Kennedy seemed so utterly clueless at oral argument that, I didn't see how either one of them was going to be able to, guide a majority. Alito was pretty clueless too, but he was sort of strategically clueless. He was trying to extract as much as possible out of the broccoli argument.
Right.
But Scalia and Kennedy were kind of all over the place, and it was clear there were very, very basic things about the economics of health insurance that they didn't get.
Right.
In the way that most Americans don't get them. I mean, that's why we have a problem with this. That's why there's a political problem with this law. But presumably by the time you got to oral argument, you would have read a few things that help you understand, why without a mandate you have a free rider problem, because we actually do provide health care to people in an emergency room, things like that.
Yeah, and what's scary is that ignorance actually won a majority of the court.
That's
so
right.
Roberts actually bought that, and Ginsburg's dissent was really brilliant. Just really did a great job of just shredding, just showing why this should have been an easy case on Commerce Clause grounds because of the unique nature of the healthcare argument. I mean, there are a lot of problems with the broccoli slippery slope argument, starting with the federal government can unquestionably do a lot of things that are a lot worse than making you buy broccoli.
Right.
The president can send nuclear weapons into Canada tomorrow, and it's not unconstitutional.
Right.
Plenty of,
and at a certain point, you can count on the political process. The whole point of having a democratic process is you can count on it to prevent completely irrational laws like making you buy broccoli. You don't necessarily need a constitutional limiting principle that excludes broccoli.
Right. I forget whether it was I believe both Roberts and the dissenters had these lengthy things about going back to James Madison and about how the structural protections of the Constitution. But what they leave out is that Madison originally did not want to place formal limits on the powers of the federal government. What Madison believed was that the separation of powers in itself would be a crucial limiting principle, and he was certainly proven right by that. The United States does not have a problem where it's too easy to pass legislation. By any respects, and Ginsburg actually noted that another thing that's going to stop the broccoli mandate from happening is simply that the political checks will work well. Right. We err on the side of not passing legislation in this country, which is one reason why we don't necessarily need the Supreme Court to arbitrarily throw out laws they don't like to sort of limit federal power.
Right.
The separation of powers itself is a very powerful structural limitation, and the dissenters sort of talked a lot about structural limitations, but sort of forgot about that one when they sort of engaged in these silly hypotheticals.
Right.
So
how do you think the court, as a kind of a scholar of the court, how do you think that how does the court go forward with after this incredibly divisive opinion, and then this series of leaks. I mean, does this change the court permanently?
It's going to be interesting because I think what the leaks reveal above all is that there clearly was a certain rift, among the conservatives. And actually, I talked to a couple of people who I know who had been Supreme Court clerks, or just to sort of try to confirm my speculations, and they sort of agreed that there's no way that clerks would talk to reporters in this short term without having the tacit approval of the justice they work for. Right. Because essentially, all of these rules are informal. So right. The only punishment that can come to you is if the justice you work for blackballs you, if you're looking for a corporate job or a job in academia or whatever. The fact that they're willing to talk so quickly makes it pretty clear that justices wanted to get this word out.
Well,
some justices were upset with
Let me suggest a counter part to that, and maybe this comes from, years and years ago that I read that Ed Lazarus book, and I've known a lot of people who've clerked over the years. But what about the idea that there's a much more tight kind of Federalist Society cabal of clerks that really views that goal as more important than the individual justice that they work for and so forth. I mean, they're used to, Scalia used to always have one liberal clerk, as I understand he no longer does. That group of essentially movement conservatives among the clerks becomes kind of a force in itself. So that they might have
cabal against the libs, I think Lazarus called it.
A cabal
that was something else that came up. Yeah, and I think that's it too. Is that that a lot of people have speculated, even Oren Kerr, the excellent conservative blogger at the Volokh Conspiracy, said that he couldn't believe these links because basically clerks would be destroying their career. And he knows more about it than I do, but I just don't see that in the sense that, if the justices want sort of Roberts to be criticized for this, I mean, who's going to blackball you? That basically, the liberals don't know who's doing the leaking, and they're probably not connected to the kind of positions that these clerks are looking for anyway. That I think you're right. There's this very self-conscious, tight-knit group, that the conservative clerks in the Thomas and Alito chambers especially, but in all the chambers, really want to get together. And you have this fundamental paradox at the heart of American conservatism, which is that you have very powerful people who are in a sort of constant state of resentment. So that even though the courts have been dominated by conservative Republicans for decades, the fact that there are certain high-profile issues in which the conservative position doesn't win means that there's this constant sense of sort of embattlement and resentment, even as you're winning a majority of the time.
Right. And even as you have basically the coolest job that a 26-year-old can have.
Right. Long hours, but
basically the launch of it. You're kind of set for life.
Exactly, and a powerful job. You're literally writing the first draft of opinions that lower courts are going to be consulting for decades in many cases. It's a great job.
Well,
as you say,
it's a funny institution. I mean, it does kind of remind me a little bit of when I worked in the Senate, where you can have this group of people at the top who kind of often hate each other's guts, and can have huge falling outs, but don't necessarily have to interact all the time. They interact in limited, informal ways. And in the old days, when you read the history, they interacted even less. Most of them didn't come to the court. They didn't work at the court, in fact. Or many of them didn't. But then you have this group underneath them who are much more tightly knit together and interact much more, and where there's much, in both alliances and fights that can be, in some ways more defining.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't understand about the court to the extent to which the justices have very little personal interaction. It's like 9 separate law firms, and normally when you interact with other justices, it's through clerks.
Right.
So as you say, that the conservative clerks in particular will interact a lot, but the justices don't necessarily interact a lot with each other. Which is one reason I never really bought the idea that Elena Kagan, whatever other virtues, was going to persuade Anthony Kennedy to join the liberals. And that generally doesn't happen. There's not the kind of personal interaction you use the law school dean. That doesn't really take place at the Supreme Court level. People pretty much have to change their mind on their own, as Kennedy did in Casey, or as as Roberts did in this case. And what you saw is that where the persuasion really came was after he switched, and it didn't work.
Right.
That Kennedy and perhaps some other conservatives did as best they can. And you remember Scalia did that with Casey, too. Right. That after Kennedy switched, Scalia would take him, his neighbor Kennedy in these long walks and try to persuade him. But, generally, the fact that Kennedy can be a swing vote sometimes doesn't mean that he isn't stubborn. Right. And O'Connor was the same way. She was moderate, but she was very firm in her own mind. She wasn't squishy. You weren't going to bully her into changing her mind.
Yeah, right.
And I think that's what a lot of people don't understand, and hopefully this case will help them understand. Roberts, whatever motivated Roberts' switch, it was not interactions with other justices. It was something that he discovered, whether it was in the writing of the opinion or whatever it was that caused him to switch. That's really how it works, and that could be one reason why these leaks happen, is that there's in a sense that the primary collaboration is among the clerks, who I assume were furious at what happened in this case. That as soon as they as it got through the grapevine that Kennedy was voting to strike the whole legislation, they must have thought that they had won, because I certainly would have thought that.
Right.
So much worse than just losing is losing when you thought you won.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, it's an extraordinary case. Now, on the question of where the politics goes from here, I mean, it's obviously, one of the things that happened immediately after the case was this Republican spin of, well, if it's under the taxing power and it's a tax, now we can really repeal it because we can do it through reconciliation with only 50 votes in the Senate.
Right.
And that got out a lot of places. And of course, that's not really true, because whether it's a tax or a penalty, anything that has a budgetary effect can be governed by a reconciliation bill, which is the kind of end of the budget process where you bring different programs and revenues and spending in line with budget projections, and you can do that whether you call it a penalty or a tax or whatever. You can include things like mining royalties in budget reconciliation, or change the student loan interest rate, which affects federal revenues. All of those things could be in a bill that has 50 votes, that only requires 50 votes in the Senate. So whatever, well before the decision, after the decision, it doesn't matter. If the Republicans really want to repeal the mandate and the enforcement mechanism that goes with it, they can do it. If they win back the Senate, retain the House, and win the presidency. No question about that.
Well, and you have a good piece about this, whereas I think that the issue here is that there's no question that they could repeal the mandate through reconciliation, although, I don't know if they want to use that bullet. But I agree with you that they have really no reason just to repeal the mandate.
Well, they have less than no reason.
Right.
One of the interesting things that you saw, interesting things that you saw happen was, Aetna a couple weeks ago. They sort of accidentally on purpose revealed that they had made significant contributions to a couple of the Republican super PACs or C4s, the kind of shadow money or dark money committees. Those are the first revelations of a publicly held company, making those kind of post-Citizens United contributions. Most of the contributions that we know about are from individuals, or in some cases they're from privately held companies, where it really doesn't matter because the owners can basically use the company as a piggyback. Publicly held companies don't usually do that. So Aetna doing that, I think, was a very big deal. They're already significant. They're already about a 65-35 Republican donor. They're the biggest lobbying player among the health insurance companies, spend the most on lobbying. And overall, the health insurance industry has, basically is staked out with the Republican Party. But they definitely all danced with the Democrat. They definitely all made sure that they had a seat at the table during the run-up to healthcare in 2009, 2010. Because they wanted to be able to shape the bill, and because it was important for the administration not to have the kind of, those were the same folks who brought the Harry and Louise assault on the Clinton healthcare bill that killed it. So it was very mutually important for both sides that the health insurance industry be basically at the table. And the interest of the health insurance industry has always been, their number one thing that they would love to have is a mandate, right? They would love to have, as many customers as possible. So you create a mandate that you need to buy health insurance. That's a great thing for them. They have to weigh that against, they're obviously not going to get a mandate all by itself, because a mandate all by itself would mean you'd have to buy, if you didn't have a requirement that insurance companies cover pre-existing conditions or whatever, you might have a mandate to buy health insurance, but you actually wouldn't be able to, nobody would sell it to you if they were able to discriminate against you. So the health insurance
industry would have no value. Right?
What's that?
Or the insurance would have no value.
Right.
Either they wouldn't sell it or you wouldn't want to buy it.
Right. I mean, it could be junk insurance. Right. So you need to have those basic standards for what a standard package is. You need a requirement of covering pre-existing conditions. You need the community rating. You need the whole set of things that I've just referred to as insurance regulation as a whole. So their interests are in finding the balance. But if it was all regulation, no mandate, they wouldn't want it. If it was all mandate, no regulation, they'd love it. And then there's two acceptable positions. One is, the status quo. They'd learned to live with that and make profits under the status quo pre-2010. And then ACA, they were basically fine with. There are things they want to tinker with, whatever. But they were so they're in an interesting position going into the case. There's the possibility. I mean, right after the Supreme Court decision, it was interesting. Its Aetna stock just shot up. And the reason was because people thought after the oral argument that, okay, it looks like either the whole thing gets struck down or the whole thing gets upheld. Either of which is okay for Aetna. So, but the worst outcome for Aetna, the terrible outcome for Aetna or any of the insurers, is only the mandate gets struck. And that way they have the requirement to cover people with pre-existing conditions and all the other regulations, but they don't have anything that's scooping up the healthy younger people who are going to pay more than they take. So they're in the worst position. This is for this same reason. Now that these companies have really reinforced their clout with the Republicans, now that they're fully back at the table with the Republicans simply are not going to just repeal the mandate. It's just not an option they have with their cash constituents. It creates a messy situation, but it's also a disaster for their cash constituents. And then you saw, within first day out, Mitch McConnell said, I make a commitment repealing this is the first thing we do. Mitt Romney says the same thing. Then 2 days later, Mitch McConnell is out in Kentucky and he says, it's a lot harder to undo something than to prevent it from happening in the first place. I think we're going to have clearly lowering expectations, kind of like Pepco here after our storms, basically saying, I wouldn't get our hopes up about repealing this. And I think that's a total reminder. I mean, we can really, I believe, have some real confidence that they're not going to be able to just strike out the mandate. And then can they repeal the whole thing? Well, they're still torn between people who want to repeal it and replace it, people who want to, when they say replace it, they want to include the very popular provisions about guaranteed issue and pre-existing conditions and children being able to stay on their, young adults being able to stay on their parents' plans and so forth. So it's I think they're really stuck, and I think we should really just, draw the line and say, here it is. We have the Affordable Care Act. It's not going anywhere. Nobody's repealing it. Now it's time to make it work. And then make it work means, making sure the insurance exchanges get set up at the state level, and then to the extent possible that states take up the Medicaid expansion, which is a huge boost for basically working low-income people. And those are the fights, not over repeal of the mandate or the other provisions.
Right, I would say, and by the way, but before we go too far in saying that Roberts must have been completely unsullied by politics, part of the logic of his Commerce Clause reasoning would seem to be the mandate is unconstitutional, but can be severed from the rest of the legislation, and there's probably a reason that Roberts didn't want to do that, which is that would be the worst outcome, for conservative interests.
Well, it was the worst outcome, and also, I mean, I don't know that much about severability, but it does seem to me sort of a particularly outrageous move for the Supreme Court to essentially write a different law. Like, it's one thing to say, we're throwing this out, come back from scratch. But it's another thing to kind of change an and to an or something like that in a way that creates a law that is not the law that anybody in Congress intended to write.
Right. And you're right. And so, I don't like that rewriting the law thing, but the severability argument had its own problem, which is that you have this ridiculous, self-refuting argument where, on the one hand, the mandate was not related to interstate commerce at all and exceeded federal power, but on the other hand, it was so integral to a scheme of regulating interstate commerce, which everybody concedes is fundamentally constitutional,
right,
the regulation of the healthcare industry. But it was so essential to the legislation that it couldn't be severed. That could have given Roberts pause. The argument that the mandate is unconstitutional but can't be severed essentially just collapses on itself immediately.
Right.
That just doesn't make any sense at all.
Right.
So that either way there was that difficult thing. So that Roberts seemed to think, and this goes back to there was an abortion case a few years ago where the court did the same thing. To reach a unanimous opinion, they basically said, well, sure, the state of New Hampshire didn't include a health exception, but we assumed they would have wanted to, so we'll just read it as if it did. Right. So that, and that's, there's some people who kind of like that, who see that as a kind of minimalist, the court not going out its way not to strike legislation. To me, it's not very minimalist at all. It's pretty much my position is pretty much send it back, and if they want something with a health exception, they can write it. This is a little bit trickier, of course, just because of the difficulty of passing healthcare legislation. That it's a real tight fix in that. I agree that there's something outrageous about essentially rewriting legislation, but there's also something outrageous about striking down the sort of signature domestic achievement of an incumbent administration that several presidents have been trying to do going back to Truman and have failed because of our multiple veto point system. So it's sort of like there were a lot of good arguments there. I mean, to me, the simple argument is just to say that, of course, this is a valid regulation of interstate commerce. That just Ginsburg opinion just avoids all of these problems. That's it. But I would say that's wrong.
We weren't wrong to say this shouldn't be a difficult case.
Right.
It only became a difficult case because it became a difficult case.
Right, exactly right, and that's and that it was just the unusual, and I think part of this just explains that again, where there are clashes between incumbent administrations and Supreme Courts just depends where you are in the political cycle. That it's not a coincidence. It's the first time this was almost happened since FDR, because FDR was in a situation where there were holdovers from the previous regime still, dominated the Supreme Court. Lyndon Johnson's expansions of the welfare state were never under constitutional threat because Democrats had been making Supreme Court appointments for decades, and even the Eisenhower appointments were, for the most part, not conservative on those issues.
Right.
So Obama was really the first president in a long time to try to expand the commitments of the federal government with the Supreme Court that had been dominated by Reagan conservatives. And so that's why it almost happened that he was in the FDR part of the cycle, not in the Johnson part of the cycle. Right. So I think that's why the bill was almost struck down. But that was what it was about. The legal arguments themselves were not very compelling, as you can tell by the fact, and this is John Cohn's point, that the Social Security privatization that was being touted by conservatives in the second term of the Bush administration would also seem to be unconstitutional under this theory, but oddly nobody thought of it at the time.
Right.
Until, so it was, maybe they didn't think about it when the Heritage Foundation was proposing this plan, because it was always a decoy. That you don't need to think about the constitutionality plans you have no intention of passing.
Well, right.
But the Social Security thing they wanted passed.
That's right. I mean, actually, the Social Security experience is a good model for why I don't think they're going to repeal the ACA, which is that they never even wrote a Social Security privatization bill. No bill ever actually, so it's not even like you can opine about the constitutionality of it, because it never even existed, and that's what we don't, we sort of forget that at the moment. Nobody ever came forward willing to introduce the Bush administration's bill, and they kind of went back and forth over, certain things would be mandated or not. Would people be mandated to, convert their private account into an annuity? All kinds of stuff that would actually be potentially interesting constitutional questions, or at least now they would be under this under this one. But they never even got. There are times when I think that that carelessness about policy matters. So that's going to matter. You know, the fact that there was no alternative to the health reform bill. There was no ability to actually construct the Social Security privatization. I mean, they can play a very, very aggressive game about challenging ideas, making ideas unpopular, bringing them down, taking them to the court, you know, promising to repeal them. But the actual work, you know, not so much.
Right, and so where I agree with you 100% that there's not going to be repealed just the mandate because they have no reason to do that, and there's not going to be the Republican. You know, as I wrote the other day, you know, as Michael Corleone would say, the Republican offer on health care is nothing.
Right.
There's no, you know, whether there might be some Republican members of Congress who would theoretically vote for something. There's no chance the Republican leadership is going to endorse any kind of comprehensive health. You know, this has been the consistent position since 1992 is they don't want to do anything.
Right.
So I would say that therefore the odds are in favor of the ACA holding up now, in the sense that if Obama wins, it's over because by the time the bill is fully implemented in 2016, you couldn't repeal it without taking away insurance from a lot of people.
Right.
What gives me pause is to say, you know, I wouldn't say that there's no chance of it being repealed just because the Republicans have that window. That if Romney wins, has a decent majority, you know, and I think it's almost certain that if he wins, he'll have the House of Representatives and the Senate. I mean, it would be unprecedented.
Right. It's unlikely. Right. It's unlikely that either that the Democrats would hold the Senate if Romney wins. There'd be enough of a wave.
Right, particularly since there are a lot more Democratic incumbents up. Right. So that you would just have that position where, you know, that it has to be basically the first 2 years of a Romney administration or never. It has to be before 2014. But, you know, given what's happening with the Medicaid expansion, that, you know, we're having sort of sustained resistance to a use of federal spending power in a way that you know, is, you know, then there was definitely some, you know, it took, you know, Arizona, you know, almost 15 years to get on board with the original Medicaid. So there was some of that. You know, Medicaid is always the toughest sell because most of the benefits go to constituencies that don't have much political power.
Right.
But still, the number of states that are resisting the Medicaid funding, and not just effectively one-party Republican states either. So that, you know, in Texas, you know, the Democrats aren't beating you, so, you know, there's not really much you can do. But, you know, Florida's not necessarily a state where there's no chance that a Democrat could beat Rick Scott, you know, for example. But they just don't, you know, that they don't really care about that. In that context, where, you know, the only way that, or, you know, that a Republican in a safe seat can lose is being defeated by a Tea Party primary candidate, you know, you never know. I wouldn't say there's a great chance that they would just repeal the whole thing, but I actually think that there is a chance. You know, I know Iglesias tried to make a case that, you know, the Republicans have a more unified caucus. You know, they could basically, you know, the reconciliation rules apply to the extent that the parliamentarians want to apply them. You know, if they're really determined to repeal it, they might. You know, I think he might overstate the possibility, but I don't think it's absolutely impossible either.
Right.
Given this modern Republican Party, if they can win in 2001.
In the wake of a terrible election for Democrats, and, you know, you've got a lot of Democrats who always run around terrified, you might have a number of Democratic votes to repeal. You know, I'm not sure who. I don't think Claire McCaskill would be there if after the election, Mary Landrieu might vote for repeal. Some of the other more conservative Democrats looking to their own re-election in 2014 or 2016 might definitely join that majority. But then what do you have? I mean, you know, this is the achievement that you would celebrate is, you know, you freed Americans from the horrible yoke of this terrible law that most of them weren't feeling as a horrible yoke anyway. You know, it's like, what have you done the day after you repeal health care? You haven't really done anything for anybody.
Right, and then you're the defender of the status quo, which is, you know, the ACA isn't very popular, but the status quo is also unpopular.
Right. It puts you in a box.
People start losing insurance as a problem.
I mean, you'd be much happier to just, you know, for as long as you can campaign against this awful health care law, the way they used to campaign against Jimmy Carter, you know, the better. And if you actually do something.
If I were a Republican leader, that's what I would do.
Right.
And 10 years ago, we could be very confident that's what the Republicans would have done. You know, it's just that, given the way the party's going, I wouldn't say that with any confidence. Remarkably enough, I don't think it's unlikely, but it's not impossible. But certainly, if Obama wins, it's not going to be repealed.
Right,
because
definitely. I mean, it's interesting.
The only reason you could repeal it is that the guaranteed issue and community rating haven't kicked in yet. I mean, that's what presents that window, and it's unfortunate we had to do that. I guess was that primarily to sort of meet the arbitrary budget targets of conservative Democrats, or were there real implementation problems?
I think they're real. I think the guaranteed. I think those things really depend on getting the exchanges set up, and I think we knew that it would take time to set up the exchanges. And of course, now with a lot of states dilly-dallying on the exchanges, they've had to, that's going to be a very compressed window.
Right. So that was something that probably couldn't have been done much earlier anyway.
Probably not. The other things were meant to push costs outside of the budget window, but I think that was more. I think that's more dependent on making the exchanges work. Well, it'll be interesting to see how the Medicaid expansion plays out, because there are two things about it. One, these are actually people. When you're reaching up to 133% of poverty, you're no longer talking about the very poorest and most disenfranchised folks. You really are talking about working poor people that gets closer, a little more into the voting population. Even people who, with a voter ID law, they probably are going to be voting. So I think it's an interesting thing. And there were a couple of polls. There was a poll 3 or 4 months ago on the approval of different aspects of the healthcare law that showed Medicaid expansion to be actually the most popular aspect of it. And I think in some ways people feel, and I've always felt that there's a tendency among liberals to fall back on the aphorism, the programs for poor people are poor programs, which is attributed to a British scholar of the mid-20th century, I guess, whose name escapes me right now. But, often a good rule, but often not. And I think when it comes to health care, people get very, very nervous about anything they feel might affect their own coverage, but they can be more comfortable with the idea of, okay, there's a population out there that, they really need some help. They're not in the same position I am. And Medicaid's a good way to do that. So the state children's health insurance program has been super popular. It was attacking that was one of the things that really hurt the Republicans in 2006, 2007. It's one of restoring that funding was one of the first things the Obama administration did. Very popular. So I think it'll be interesting to see. I think Democrats are a little sheepish about really defending the Medicaid funding and really picking a fight about that because they assume a fight about poor people is a fight they lose. But I actually think it's a very, very winnable fight, especially when you have the allies among the hospitals and healthcare providers in a state that, are typically, they're going to be providing care to these folks whether they get reimbursed by Medicaid or not, and they certainly prefer to be reimbursed by Medicaid.
Yeah, the one advantage you have is that when you start using the federal spending power, then powerful constituencies start to line up on your side. The same constituencies that might, oppose certain aspects of the healthcare reform bill do it. Now, in and of itself, that won't do it. That essentially, a government that really wants to can do whatever it wants. So there's going to be some states where the Tea Party, they don't care. And it won't just be the powerful interest. I do agree with you, and I think David Dan's made this point that there is going to need to be some political struggle. But on the other hand, in some of these states, political struggle without the powerful interest also wouldn't do much. The civil rights movement is the most powerful, and effective kind of moral persuasion that we've seen in recent American history, and yet it's not like they ever persuaded Southern legislators to abandon segregation. That you need to be so that ultimately they're just political fights that can't be won if you have people who are just determined not to do things. Which in some states like Texas, there's just not much political price you can pay. In those states, you're going to need organized interest to put a lot of pressure on the incumbent governments. But there are other states like Florida where I think political struggle is necessary and helpful.
And you might not. It's also that struggle might result in Rick Scott losing, not necessarily persuading Rick Scott to engage in normal politics. I mean, we do have a lot of these, governors like Scott and like Rick Scott and Scott Walker, who, they've sort of taken the brakes off. And
that's the thing. You're going to have to beat them. They're not going to take the money in their own, probably. Barring, again, interest just going crazy. But you could use this issue to beat them. And I would agree that Democrats shouldn't be shy. And in healthcare, that people can show more solidarity than you think. That Republicans have, in trying to sort of, privatize or gut Medicare, have always tried to play off existing beneficiaries against future ones. Saying, oh, well, don't worry, your benefits are safe. It's just sort of the future. But that doesn't seem to work.
Right.
That even people getting the benefits still don't favor changes to Medicare. They want it there for their grandchildren.
Right. Well, that's another thing. That's the Ryan plan, which we'll get a test of in this election, and that's essentially a big part of the fight about Medicaid and other aspects of the ACA. So it'll be a real test of whether people are able to extend beyond their own limited perspective, or in tough economic times, they kind of latch on to what they have and oppose everything else.
Yeah, and Romney is apparently Romney thinking of making Ryan his vice presidential candidate. That would seem like a real.
I mean, that would really make it. That would really make it. I mean, to me, that would really bring to the fore what I think is really different about our politics right now, which is a real test of whether, I was talking about how it's a political scientist, that old theorem that, Americans are philosophical conservatives but operational liberals. And, but most of politics have operated on that assumption. The Republicans like to talk about things like abstractions like balanced budget amendment or a cap on entitlements, but really not mess with the basic benefits that people are getting. And here with Ryan, the first real test of, creating a generational and other kinds of showdown about actual spending, in the specific and not the abstract. Incredible, and that's to me the only interesting thing about the election, which will be the case to some extent, even without Ryan on the ticket, but certainly Ryan on the ticket would magnify it.
Right, because there seems to be pressure to support the Ryan budget anyway, but it's just selecting Ryan, from my perspective, makes it a lot harder for Romney to sort of selectively scale away from that. You can't oppose the Ryan budget when Ryan's there. So I would think that, but I'll say if they do that, I think that would probably be a net benefit to the Democrats, but it would also raise the stakes of election one. If Romney wins with Ryan as his vice president,
it's a whole different. This is a really different world we're moving into. This is not, another Bush administration. It's a whole different deal.
Right, and that's why I would not be entirely confident saying that the act won't be repealed, because, as you said earlier, if the Republicans win a big victory and they do it with Ryan or somebody running with Ryan's agenda as on the ticket, they could feel pretty empowered to do a lot of things. Now, the things they do may render the Republicans unable to win national elections for a long time after that, but I think that there are a lot of conservatives who see this as their window. That they may be willing to pay a long-term price to do a lot of damage to the New Deal and Great Society now. I'm really hoping we don't find out about that, particularly since a Romney administration would probably involve a Supreme Court meeting justice who would be more conservative than Anthony Scalia. Right. All right,
well, on that gloomy note, I want to wrap this up. And really appreciate you doing this. This is your first time on Blogging Heads. I don't think we noted that at the beginning.
So pleasure to be on board.
Hopefully not your last. And really appreciate you doing this, Scott.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Mark. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.